we're very happy to see the level of engagement and participation. We have more than 80 participants with us today. So we do hope that at the end, we can make some sense of the data that we do have and of the data that we are missing to guide us in normal times through tourism, but also specifically in these times where it's so challenging to understand how the impact will change and how can we see, if possible, the green shoots coming out, hopefully from the different markets. I have a very complete group of speakers with me today. I have the representative of Adara, which is Mrs. Sara Pastor with me. Also from Forward Keys, Olivier Ponty is going to share data and insights into what are we looking at in terms of airline bookings. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome, Olivier. I also have with us Philippe Wooler, who's going to share information and insights on the hotel industry, and Olivier from Travel Stats, who's going to tell us about the travel sentiment. What are people discussing online? And finally, we also have Carmen with us, who's going to give us an insight into what do destinations need. And at this moment, I just realized our regional director for Africa, Mrs. Elsia Gancourt, just joined us. So Elsia, I'll give the floor to you to do some introductory remarks before we dive into the data.
Thank you, Sandra. Can you see me? Sorry. I had some challenges connecting, but happy to see that all our panelists are there, as well as we've already kickstarted. I think you've already introduced the speakers from what I understand. I don't know if you talked about the poll also that we'll be doing throughout this, but I'm also told that we have to be very strict with our timing today because there is another webinar that's going to happen right away after us. So again, I would welcome everybody. This is the second series of our webinar that we've been doing, because in this difficult moment, we're all trying to see how best we give support to our members, to our partners, and these kind of discussion definitely help to put in perspective, especially when we talk about data for the Africa region. We often say it's too limited, it's fragmented, and now we see that there's quite a bit of challenge that is happening on the ground. There are a lot of cancellations that has happened. The forward bookings also are very slow coming in, but with the very little data that is available, this is very critical in helping us to map forward the strategies that the different partners, tourism boards, etc. need in their approaches. So I'm hoping that with this discussion, the different partners and speakers can give us a perspective of the Africa region, where they see us now. Especially, I'm happy to see that we also have Carmen that is on the ground to give us a little bit of the sense that she's feeling also. But at the same time, we will be running this poll to make it a bit interactive. So as Sandra may have mentioned, we'd like you to send in your questions, because in between the presentations, then we will address the questions that is being sent in by the different listeners listening in. So with that, I hope that we are able to share maximum information that we have, especially on data, and I pass it over to you, Sandra. Thank you.
Thank you, Elsia, and thank you everyone again for being on the call. As Elsia mentioned, we'll have some polls in between presentations, and again, I would stress the importance of you sharing your comments with us as well, and your questions, to make sure that we try to address them during the call. Before I give the floor to the panelists who are gonna specifically enter into different segments of tourism, and specifically more on Africa, I'll do a very quick setting the scene, and I'll share my screen with you. I hope that you can see it well. Just to give you an overview of where we are in global terms, and obviously also the challenges that we face in actually having an accurate view of the impact in many of the areas. So for the moment, we are facing, obviously, still in the pandemic process, and I think this is very important. Our biggest challenge in most of the countries is to curb the pandemic. This is a condition without which it will be difficult to see any movement going on. So in that sense, UNWTO has been working very closely with all the partners in the sector, but also with the World Health Organization to make sure that our response is adequate to the situation. I think this is something when we talk about impact and future looking, we cannot forget this will be the biggest trigger of anything that happens in the sector, is how long will the pandemic last, if we see a second wave or not, and how effective the measures that are being taken are. So I think it's important that when we look at data, not only tourism data, we need to be looking at these indicators as well. One of the major challenges that we face, obviously, is that currently almost all destinations around the world have implemented some kind of restriction to their borders. So virtually we have international tourism and in many countries domestic tourism as well, because of the containment measures, totally stopped. UNWTO is monitoring on a weekly basis the level of related travel restrictions to COVID, and the report that just came out a few days ago shows that almost 100 countries in the world have totally or partially closed their borders. Often the operations that are ongoing are repatriation of tourists or other kind of movement. So virtually we are on a standstill. What does this mean in terms of international tourism? And I'd like to make a little break here. UNWTO has been monitoring the impact, and now it's collecting the first data for this year. So we will start to see actually what has been the impact on the ground. But on a very early estimate, and we will update this estimate early next week, we passed, just to give you an idea of how volatile the situation has been, we've passed from an initial forecast that talked about 1 to 3% to 20 to 30, and we're probably, without wanting to open the discussion, probably going to see this double in our next, at least double in our next forecasts. If we would look into a loss of 20 to 30%, just to see the magnitude, we will be back into levels of international travel that we had 7-8 years ago. So the challenge here is not only the immediate impact, but it's also how long we will take to actually get back to the previous levels in terms of demand, and also how does the supply actually adapt to that level of demand. Just to give you an idea, and again, this were the preliminary estimates, we will be talking about losing at least 1/3 of all the tourism exports. And we now know this is going to be much, much higher. What do we know up to now in global terms? We know that according to ICAO, capacity has been down in all the regions, around 40 to 50% at least in the month of March, and we will see from forward keys how this has evolved in April. We also know that in terms of air travel, there's an estimate that says that we will lose between 44 and 80% of all international passengers. Obviously, there will be different scenarios, and this is also what UNWTO is working on, and this is what we're going to release next week. And my advice also for those on the ground is to work with scenario planning. The level of uncertainty that we're facing requires us to consider different scenarios, when it will open and how it will open, when different time options, when we can see some kind of inflection point. So this is where we are at the moment. For Africa, just to share with you also what the International Civil Aviation Organization is forecasting, they're talking about a decrease in capacity that could go from -40 to -72. You'll actually see that the ranges are very similar across regions, also because, again, the uncertainty level is so big. And for those dealing with data, don't feel bad, because everyone will tell me how much it's going to decrease in my country, and that's a big challenge. We really need to have this approach of having all the considerations together, and the margins of impact assessment in the whole of the year will naturally be big, because we don't know when and how borders may happen to open. Again, looking at the estimates by IATA in terms of passengers, they're talking about a minus 50%, with all the regions very much similar, except for North Africa, where probably the domestic market has a big weight, and this is why the impact is probably lower. Also, one of the big challenges that we face is that the fact that the countries which have been so far, and again, this is information that we are updating at the moment, the countries which have been more impacted are also probably the top source markets in the world, which means that when we look at the potential to recover, this will always be one of the biggest challenges that we will be facing, not only because of the pandemic impositions, but also because of the economic impact that the closures might have on those source markets. The question that everyone is asking, and I say the billion-dollar question or crystal ball question, is when do we see recovery happen? Obviously, again, we'll need to play with scenarios at this moment. We cannot say it's going to be in July, September, December, but I think it's useful to look back into how long we might be in terms of that recovery. And UNWTO has looked into how long the world has taken to recover from previous crises. So in terms of going back to the same level of demand that was there before, so the same number of tourist arrivals as pre-crisis, and with SARS, it took us 11 months. With the September 11 attacks, 14 months, and with the global economic crisis, as much as 19 months. But if we look into the regions that were most hit in each of the situations, we see that that time is higher. So we come as, for example, Europe, which was one of the most affected regions during the global economic crisis of 2009, took almost 30 months to go back to the same levels as there were before. And the Americas, after September 11, took 3.5 years to actually have the same levels of demand that previous. It's true that in the case of the Americas, there was the impact of 9/11 together with an economic crisis and the SARS outbreak in 2003. But again, I think we need to consider all the scenarios and be prepared for them. So as I mentioned, the most impacted region was the Americas, and it took like 42 months to actually go back to the previous levels. So this is obviously one of the challenges that we have, is how this is going to impact in terms of employment, in terms of jobs, because being one of the most affected sectors, but also one of the most job intensive sectors, our challenge at this point is how to protect people and also how we will recover those jobs. In the past, we've seen that after the economic crisis, jobs in tourism grew much faster than the whole economy. So this is also one of the key factors that we need to use as data providers to our governments to say, if you support tourism at this point, then you can support job creation in a much more accelerated way. So this is one of the key factors that for us is important, is to measure how the jobs will recover as well. So finally, before I give the floor to our colleagues, I just wanted to finish with this message. I think for us, this is a very key point. We know that the challenges are big. We know that what's coming ahead is going to be, in some cases, a hard path, but we do trust that there is pent-up demand. People want to travel as soon as the conditions are there, and obviously as soon as we all work together to improve consumer confidence, which is going to be key in this moment. So with that, I finish my overall setting the scene to our discussion on details. And before I actually pass the floor to our first speaker, I'm going to try and engage with the 129 people I see linking in this call. So you do see the question on the screen, I believe, and we'd like to hear from you. what is your biggest challenge in terms of tourism data and intelligence? So I'm gonna leave the poll running for a while we start with the first presentation, but we'd like to know if your biggest challenge is budget, skills on the ground of your people, identifying the relevant information to create your KPIs, or the lack of coordination with data partners in your country. So I'll leave the poll running, and meanwhile, I think if I put it down, you won't see it anymore. And I'll give the floor to our first speaker, which is Oliver Ponti, who's going to share with us an overview of airline data and what is telling us at the moment. Olivier, you have the floor.
Maybe Sandra, just before
yes.
two questions that kept coming up. Everybody is asking about the presentations that
yes.
being shared. This after the call, obviously after the webinar, we will be doing a summary. We will share with you all the presentations as well as answers to some of the questions that may be asked. Okay, over to you, Olivier.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to you and the WTO for inviting us to this conference, and thank you to the attendees for joining us today. My name is Olivier Ponti. I'm Vice President for Insights at Forward Keys, and during this presentation, we'll focus on the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on air travel to Africa. Before I start presenting you with the data, just a few words about Forward Keys and about the data that we're going to look at together. Forward Keys, we're a travel analytics company. We're based in Valencia, Spain, and we're really working B2B, providing our clients with near real-time monitoring of the air travel markets. In order to do this, we use different data sets. We look at searches that people perform prior to their booking of a trip. We look at capacities that airlines put on the market, and we also look at the bookings that are made and the tickets that are being issued, which gives us the most comprehensive data set on direct and indirect air bookings worldwide. So what does this data tell us about the current impact of the crisis on Africa and on the world in general? Let's try to put the results for Africa in a more global context. Here we're looking at international arrivals year to date, that is as of the 26th of April of this year. Total arrivals, international arrivals worldwide have decreased by about 54%. As you can see, Africa is the least impacted country with destination, with minus 43%, way behind the Asia Pacific, minus 61%, Europe minus 54%, and the Middle East and the Americas are much closer to Africa in terms of performances. I think this has to do with a delayed impact. Africa is less reliant than other parts of the world on the source markets from the Asia Pacific, and actually started really feeling the pain of this crisis when the pandemic reached Europe. We'll see this in a minute. Let's zoom in on Africa and the different regions so that we understand this global figure a bit better. We see that Northern Africa has been more impacted on so far than Sub-Saharan Africa, minus 51% for Northern Africa and minus 40% for Sub-Saharan Africa. This has a lot to do with the guest mix of those regions. Northern Africa is much more dependent on tourists traveling from Europe than Sub-Saharan Africa, which has a more varied mix of travelers. So basically, when Europeans stopped traveling to Northern Africa, this region was very severely hit, while Sub-Saharan Africa felt the pain as well, but was still getting some visitors from the Americas, which delayed once more a bit the impact. Now that's for the past. Let's try to look at the future. And in order to do this, I'd like to have a look at bookings made for international travel to Africa by departure regions. So here we're looking at bookings made for any future trip to Africa by world regions, and those are net bookings. So it's possible to go below the 100% line. When you go below this dotted line here, it means that you have more cancellations than bookings. Now, in the first phase of the epidemics, which was introduced by the implementation of travel restrictions in China, it's mainly the Asian Pacific markets that stopped booking Africa, but the rest of the key source markets kept booking. From the moment that the pandemic expanded to Europe, we could see a significant drop in bookings from all source markets to Africa, and that's when the destination entered really in crisis mode. So in total, bookings for any future trip are 69%, almost 17% behind globally. What we would like to see in the future, of course, is this red line going past the dotted line, which means that we would start seeing more bookings than cancellations. North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa are impacted in similar ways. So there's really no winner within the continent of this situation, as it is the case worldwide. No one is winning from the current crisis. Now, in order to understand when recovery will take place and the extent of the current crisis, we need to have a look at the supply side as well. So I'd like here to focus on seating capacity, so the number of international seats put on the market by airlines. This is the global picture worldwide for international seating capacity. As you can see here, seating capacity nowadays is just a fraction of what it was just a year ago. It's less than 10%. There's no difference by world region. The situation is dire everywhere around the world. And at this stage, it's very difficult to know how the air landscape will look like when we get across this crisis. Many airlines are going through a very, very rough time, some of them being on the either bankrupt already or on the verge of bankruptcy. In Africa, we've got the case of Air Mauritius, for example, that has filed for bankruptcy, or South African Airways that is also on the verge of closing. So a very different landscape in terms of connectivity when we get across this crisis, that's for sure. The other thing to take into account on the supply side is that most destinations in Africa are still not truly open for business. There are travel restrictions pretty much everywhere across the continent. And of course, recovery will very much depend on whether or not those travel restrictions are lifted and when they are lifted. If there's any kind of coordination by sub-region or not, will probably play a role in the recovery scenario. Looking at the future and focusing on the summer for source markets from the northern hemisphere, we're looking here at long-haul travelers planning a trip to Africa in June, July, or August. The overall picture is very negative. Of course, all key destinations are behind, but what I would like to stress here is that we've got two exceptions in this top 10. That's Cape Verde and Namibia, that are registering significantly better results than the rest. That comes mainly from the fact that there has been less cancellations for those future trips during the summer. And one possible explanation is that these countries have some of the lowest numbers of recorded COVID cases. So maybe this plays a role in the fact that people that have already a booking for this summer for those destinations have not canceled them yet. And that stresses the importance of communication and of having the COVID-19 crisis under control in order to be able to plan recovery and get some bookings for the coming months. Still looking at the summer and booking patterns for the summer, what we can learn from the past is that most of the bookings for that period are made in June, July, and August for long-haul travelers. And that means that most of the bookings for the summer are yet to come. Two ways to look at this. The optimistic way is to say, well, that means that it is still possible to salvage the summer between the delayed bookings and the standard booking patterns. The other way to look at it is to say, well, we don't have that many bookings for this period already made, so we're in a tough spot. I'll let you decide whether you want to see the bottle half full or half empty. That chart clearly is in favor of an optimistic approach. Let's say here we're looking at the way people from a key source market for many destinations in Africa, that is France, are searching for their future trip. And what we can see analyzing those searches is that people, French people in that case, are more looking for trips during Q3 and Q4. Often regional trips, but more often than in the past, also long-haul destinations. And I guess this is an opportunity for all African destinations. It means that even though French people, but other key source markets in Europe and across the world are not booking, they are still searching for their next flight. There is still a willingness to travel. I'd like to conclude on these thoughts. Yes, the current situation clearly is very challenging, but it is also an opportunity. It's the opportunity for destinations to be smart, to make good use of the data that is available and that will help understanding signs of recovery as soon as those signs of recovery appear. That will help destinations understand where to invest their marketing money and make data-driven decisions that will fit the objective they have in terms of growth for the future. So I'd like to leave you with this idea and wish you good luck for your recovery plans. Thank you.
Olivier, there is one question based on the graph that you shared, which asks, what explanation can you share maybe for the lowest decline or cancellation for bookings in Africa? If you go back to that slide, this is the question that is coming up.
Are we talking about this slide, the summer outlook, or about what has happened so far here? Well, in both cases, I think this has a lot to do with the way the pandemic has expanded. If we're looking at this one very clearly, we can see the first step here. It started in the Asia Pacific. That's also the region that has been the most severely impacted. Then expanded to Europe, second most impacted, and then to the rest of the world. So that means that source markets here dried out almost immediately. Then when the pandemic reached Europe, those source markets dried out as well. If, like Africa, you're less dependent than the rest of the world on the markets from the Asia Pacific, it means that you feel the pain a bit later than the rest of the world. And you can start feeling the pain when Europeans stop booking, especially Northern Africa. And the sub-Saharan region felt the pain because of Europe, but also because of the Americas that were impacted a bit later down the road. I hope this answers the question.
I suppose, yes.
Yes. Thank you, Olivier.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Sarah,
I
back
think,
to you.
yeah, thank you so much. I think I would add probably one point as well that you mentioned, which is unlike many of the other regions, 50% of the traffic in Africa is intra-regional. So maybe that took some time as well to feel the impact, as you mentioned. Thank you so much, Olivier, for taking us through the impact in airlines. And now give the floor to Sarah Pastor from Adara, who would now combine both sides of the story and take us through what we're seeing in bookings in terms of hotels, but also airlines. Thank you, Sarah.
Many thanks, Sandra. Thanks for having me. It's my pleasure to be part of today's webinar. My name is Sarah Pastor. I'm MD for Destinations at Adara. For those who don't know about who we are, we've been partnering with the different verticals of the sector. So from meta searches, online travel agencies, GDSs, hotel chains, airlines, airports, car rentals, etc. We partner with almost 300 travel companies, and they give us data of what people are searching, booking, and loyalty program. Just for you to picture, we are a big data company because we can see more than 900 million travelers every month. So that's a lot of people, a lot of travelers, but I always say that big data per se, it just means a lot, a big quantity of information. It's how we transform that into smart data, into intelligence that then we can apply into our daily basis. And similar to what Olivier was saying, we always like to look at any situation, crisis or no crisis, through 3 different steps. The first one is the learning, analyzing all this data. The second one is the action, taking the conclusions of this data and put it into communication plans and recovery plans. And the last but not least is the measurement, and see if actually what we've done has been effective or not. Today, what I would like to focus is on the first part, which is the analysis, the learning. And when I look in how we can identify, and Sandra has mentioned it as well, is the inflection point, right? Like when is that moment where I can start launching my recovery plans and invite travelers to come back to my destination. And the way you will see the data that I've included today, it's we look at similar to Olivier, to the past, what we have seen from January to today, and also comparing year over year, but also looking into the future. And as Sandra mentioned, searches versus bookings, so it gives us complementary insights. To start with, and this is unfortunately, it's very similar to what Olivier showed in terms of airlines. This is hotel data. The numbers from the beginning of the year to today, they are not very optimistic. And if this is hotel bookings from the beginning of the year to date, and comparison to where we were last year. And if I look at specifically to Africa from an origin, I've looked at it from an origin outside Africa, so international arrivals to Africa. It's similar, it's still negative. But those who know me, they know that I'm always trying to look for optimistic views and opportunities that lay ahead. And it is true that not necessarily the rest of the world we will follow the trends that we are seeing in China. But since China was the first country to be affected by the COVID-19, I think it's really important to track and analyze the trends that we are seeing there. The graph that you're seeing here, it's searches and bookings to China as a destination. And you will see that I've separated the domestic versus the international, because I think it's also interesting to see how the different behaviors are. And if we look at the international, obviously when it was the outbreak, it was really negative. Then they started to obviously get better than the rest of the world since they started, and we saw an upward trend again. However, they had to implement restrictions because they were scared about another outbreak. So again, it went down, but the positive and the opportunity is that starting to go upwards. And the same way, if we are looking at the domestic trend of searches and bookings to China, it was pretty flat, starting a little bit up and down, but the trend it's going upward. So I don't know, when I foresee the inflection point in the rest of the world, I kind of have a feeling that it's going to be similar. It's not going to be a straight line. It's going to be up and downs, peaks and valleys. But hopefully in the next weeks, we will start seeing this upward trend as well in the rest of the world. This is, let me see, this is bookings. And the way that I would like to also look at this inflection point is not only about how, searches and bookings from the past, but it's also depending on what type of traveler we are looking at. And obviously, from one hand side, you're seeing a graph where we have differentiated for EMEA business and leisure travelers. It makes sense that when the outbreak started, the first audience impacted was leisure. The business travelers, it took a little bit longer to start going down. And as you can see, it's kind of like it's in a plateau, but still it's up and down in terms of the interest of the bookings for business travelers. It's interesting here because when I speak to most of the destinations and also institutions, most of us, we are perceiving that the first audience that it's going to reactivate, it's going to be the leisure. And the reason why it's first, we've been in lockdown, so we are looking forward to traveling again. And also because when speaking to companies, they are going to be extra careful of sending their employees on business trips for legal purposes. So though the business travelers, they were more resilient than leisure, we are expecting that the leisure travelers are going to start reactivating sooner than the business ones. And if we look specifically at the leisure travelers, what you can see here, it's more the bookings, but also when they are booking. So the pink, I would like to highlight the pink one, which is 0 to 15 days, and the kind of orange one, which is more than 91 days. And if you can see, the ones that they've been having more activity in the last weeks, they are these ones, which means that, you know, people who have to travel as a must, you know, in the next 3 weeks, that's the pink one. And then we have, and that's probably proximity markets, so also like origin markets where they are more, as someone was mentioning, Germany has not affected them much, right? So they've been able to move for some destinations, and they're going to be able to move a little bit quicker than others. And then obviously people are also like looking to travel in a longer term to make sure that they can travel. So this was more kind of like the past. I would like to look into the future, and this is actually checking dates for hotel bookings from now onwards. And again, looking at the opportunities, there is a peak here in mid-end of May, and this is more for proximity travel. And it's true that when we compare a hotel and versus flights, the way that they reacted in terms of giving flexibility to their cancellation policies, they were much quicker. They either were making it easy for travelers to cancel, or they were giving vouchers to reuse the booking that has not been able to be able to enjoy, so they can enjoy later on. So that's why we see a peak here. And then again, similar to what Olivier was saying, it starts picking up again after the summer, so September till the end of the year. And the same information that we see in the bookings, we also see in the searches. You can see here, I've put 2 examples of Europe and US in terms of origin markets. We see that, for instance, in Europe, this is year over year, the number of searches, and obviously we are still negative in the next weeks. But it's important here to look at, it's at the trend. So here we can see that they are augmenting, even if they are less from last year, but they are getting better. Then we see in Europe like a flat line until the end of August, and it starts going upwards again. So similar to what I just showed in terms of bookings and check-in dates. And the same way for the US, actually the US, what we are seeing, it's really an upward trend directly from now to mid-August, and then a huge improvement end of August, beginning of September. So this is very similar again to what Olivier was showing in terms of airlines. It's very aligned in terms of what we are seeing in accommodation. But again, these are the opportunities, like a short-term opportunity in May, June for those who really want to escape and travel again if they can and they are allowed. And if not, they are postponing their trips from September onwards. And if I can just give you a summary of what I showed in terms of what I would recommend you to look for this inflection point, would be, it's again, looking at searches and bookings. Searches, they give us the intent, and it's giving you the idea when to launch these awareness campaigns for the recovery plans for your destination. And bookings, it's kind of like this ratio to compare and make sure that actually it's starting to convert. So that's another opportunity. Keep an eye on the historical data, but also in the future data, so that you can see this inflection point and see how the graphs are evolving. In the short term, I recommend more a micro analysis for more the proximity markets to your destination, and also for the origin markets that they are already opening the borders, because there is going to be a de-escalation, and the de-escalation is going to be different from origin market to another. Versus, do not forget to keep, from a macro level, mid-long term, all the origin markets from an international point of view to your destination, and keep an eye how they are evolving. Obviously comparing China trends to COVID trends to be able to, foresee how probably that's going to affect you as well. Keeping in mind also the different type of audiences to your destinations. And last but not least, even if, the borders are open and the searches, the intent is there, we need to keep an eye, as Oliver said, on the air capacity, because even if people want to travel to your destination, if they cannot travel, that's something that we need to take into consideration. And something that it's kind of more emotional and more sentiment, and I know they will speak about it later, but it's a security perception. We can have everything, we can have all the numbers, we can have all the securities, but if that origin market has a concern on the security perception of traveling to your destination, it's something that we need to tackle into the recovery plan, in the communications plan, and take that into consideration to regain their trust and invite them to come back to your destination. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions later on. But if I can just leave you with a last thought, remember that in data and technology, more than ever now can help you to build this intelligence tourism system and help you to identify all these opportunities so that you can be more effective and efficient in your media plans and recovery plans. And it can help you understand if those are actually working or not, so that you can create this virtuous cycle of learning, action, and measurement. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for those insights. I think just before we continue, there is a question that came, and I think everyone is looking for the same. We all say domestic will recover before international, and you just mentioned, and many people mention it as well, that we'll see leisure recovering before business travel. And the people who are with us today are asking why, and if you can elaborate a little bit more on that.
So business versus leisure, right? So this is obviously we don't have a magic ball, as Sandra was saying at the beginning. This is more an opinion out of many conversations with destinations and public organizations such as UNWTO. But so when we think about business traveler, I don't know if you remember in February, I'm from Barcelona, and they canceled the Mobile World Congress, right? And after the Mobile World Congress, more trade shows were canceled. And one of the main reasons not only was for the spread of the virus, but it was also like the legal liabilities that companies could incur if they were sending their employees. So that's why we expect that leisure travel is going to reactivate sooner, because one, we've been in lockdown, and people who are passionate travelers like myself, we are going to be looking to travel again, and it's going to reactivate. People are going to like to travel again, but companies that are going to be extra careful because of this legal liability. Because if they are sending someone for a business trip and that person gets sick, that could have a negative effect on the companies. But again, we don't have this magic ball. It's more like for all the conversations that we are having in the industry. Hope that helps.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you so much for that. I think that's a very important point, and the issue of liability and cancellation policies is going to be more and more important. We're seeing this in Europe with the big pressure on the issue of vouchers versus reimbursements. And I think moving towards the future, considering the uncertainties, the policies, and that applies to business travel, on protecting travelers will be more and more important. So without further ado, I would just like to ask all, I think you can see the pool. If you confirm, we have so far 112 answers out of 145. So the ones who haven't voted, you're still on time. And actually 42% of the participants say that the biggest challenge is the lack of coordination with data partners in my country. So there is a need to create that coalition of data partners in your own country. The second challenge is relevant information. How do I know what's relevant for my KPIs? The third is budget, and the fourth is skills. So very interesting that the second is actually to identify relevant information. I would probably expect people to say budget or skills. So very interesting to see that it's really about finding out what your KPIs are and then looking for that source that fills that data gap. Without any further delay, I'd like to ask Philippe Uller from STR Global to give us the picture on hotels, where we are and what can we expect in the near future without crystal balls.
I'm here, sorry. I will just be a second.
We can hear you perfectly.
Okay, sorry. Can you see my screen?
No, not yet. Yes, now it's working.
Okay, sorry about that. No, it's interesting, isn't it? We come across that question, when do we think people will start to travel? And, you know, I was drawn to your slide, Sandra, travel tomorrow, and that wonderful picture. And you just get a sense of, you know, without, you know, in not too much time, I think people will start to think, yes, I will be traveling fairly shortly. So let's hope so. So my name is Philip Woolley. I'm area director for STR, and I'm based in Dubai. So I've just got a few slides. I know we've only got a little bit of time, but I just wanted to give you an idea of what is happening around the world, and then obviously more specifically in Africa. So this actually is the occupancy for the regions. Now it's Q1, so we can argue that we have January, February in there, which did have quite a big impact on global occupancies. But even so, we can see that as an average, this is fairly poor. In North Africa, we had an average occupancy for Q1 of 46%. In Southern Africa, 50%. And the main declines really came in sort of late February and late March. So I think, you know, really important to see that we're in a similar picture everywhere. There is no one region that sticks out more than others. In terms of revenue per available room, and this is just effectively the revenue generated by rooms, this is how it looked in the first quarter of 2020. These are the declines. So, you know, obviously significant. In normal times, this would be horrific, but in bearing in mind what has happened over the last few weeks, not so bad. But I think the picture changes when we look at April, and we can quite clearly see the extent of the problem. We have Europe running at just over 10% occupancy. The Middle East is a little bit higher, a smaller sort of a smaller hotel market, a huge amount of hotel rooms in the quarantine bank. So running at 30%, Asia Pac at 29%. When we look at North Africa and Southern Africa, we can see what percentage of rooms are actually occupied. So we can see the level of the problem. I would probably suggest we are, in some of these markets anyway, at the bottom. There is no real place to go to drop any further. So we would hope, and obviously there's different parts of the planet are at different stages with the virus, but obviously an idea of where we sit. And then this really is the a pretty awful picture. Again, looking at the total revenue that a hotel generates and how that has declined year on year. So we're literally comparing April 2020 to April 2019. And huge drops. I mean, Europe is 90% down, and North America 80%, and across Africa, North Africa 90% down, and Southern Africa 86% down. So some remarkably deep drops right across the planet. I know Sandra touched on this, but you know, it puts things into perspective a little bit, the GDP impact, and I actually think these have been marked down a little bit over the last few days. In Kenya, I saw a lot of people on call from Kenya, 1.1 billion USD, that is the GDP impact. South Africa, I mean, some serious numbers. Egypt, $2.5 billion, and also Morocco. So we have Nigeria in there. So it is remarkable numbers that we are seeing all across the planet. Looking at Africa, a lot of the guys will know, when this all started. I remember actually sitting in my office mid-March and wondering if Africa was going to get away with it, because I think at that stage there were no cases in Africa, and I think maybe the first case was maybe the 19th or 20th of March, but then things started to build quite quickly, and this just gives you an idea of the cases across the continent. The biggest, the highest number of cases, obviously South Africa, Egypt, Morocco and Algeria, which I thought was a little bit lower, but I think every country has some cases. I might be wrong there. There might be one or two with no cases, but we just have to hope that with the current situation of lockdowns, things are beginning to get more contained and things will progress from here. Again, I think Sandra touched on this. This gives an idea of the general situation in terms of border closures, also airline, what the situation is from an airline point of view, whether it's partial or what the restrictions are. But I think all across the continent, a very, very similar position to where the Middle East was. We've actually seen some changes in the last few days where some of the restrictions have been relaxed. Now, that's not to say cases are not going up, but the general consensus is that there is a degree of containment. So here in the UAE, for example, there is, we can move around during the day. Offices are beginning to close, beginning to open. So, hopefully Africa is not far from that containment, and then things might progress from here. I'm not going to go through these individually, but again, you guys will know. I think South Africa was an interesting one because I believe there was a mandate that all hotels must close in South Africa. There were a handful still open and operating as quarantine hotels. I think South Africa took an interesting decision to ban the sale of alcohol and cigarettes. I'm not sure how that one went down, but that's where we are in South Africa at the moment. And I think, many of the countries there are beginning to look at possible lifting of restrictions. Similar sort of trend to the airline data. Obviously, we're moving from the 2nd of February. This is occupancy on the left-hand side. We can see some of those cities there from Addis all the way through to Nairobi. We're operating at reasonable occupancies all the way through to middle of February, really, and then we can start to see the declines, and very, very quick declines. And this is a very similar picture to all the other cities across the planet. As soon as COVID-19 started to hit, we saw declines very, very quickly. And again, you can see on the far right-hand side that occupancies are averaging round about sort of 20, from 10% up to 20. I think Lagos may be a little bit stronger at 30%. So yeah, we're in a pretty tough situation. In terms of occupancy actuals, Lagos is a little bit higher, probably a double whammy with the oil price, but Lagos, with the sample that we have, is just under 40%. We move through Casablanca, just over 20%, and all the way through to Nairobi, which is pretty tough. I mean, what's that, sort of 6 or 7%, and a decline of 85% on the normal sort of occupancy level. But all have been hit rather badly. We hope we are at the bottom. We think things will begin to change over the next 3 to 4 weeks, but that's where we sit at the moment. This is RevPAR. So again, revenue per available room. What is in the pot to work with does not include F&B and other revenue, but it gives you a sense of what is happening all across the continent. Huge changes in revenue per available room, sort of Nairobi 91%, Cairo 95%, Casablanca. So it's a pretty tough data coming out of Africa at the moment. Just really looking at where we see now. I'm sorry, we don't do a forecast for Africa at the moment, but this is a forecast through to the end of 2020, and it just gives a sense of where we think the markets will move. to some extent, you know, a little bit surprisingly, China, that is kind of coming out of some of the problems that it has, recovery to some extent. So we do think that through to the end of the year, it's going to be very, very tough. The US probably is going to be hit more than any other continent or any other region, 51% down. So generally speaking, and that's in RevPAR, average room rate across all the regions is less affected. Obviously, there's no way to really sort of drive in any demand, no matter what the rate, to a large extent. So there's not an awful lot of movement in average room rate, and occupancy is declining, as we looked at a little bit earlier. China, just really a quick look at China, because I think, you know, some of the problems in China started maybe late December, early January, but we can see how China has moved over a period of time. And currently China around about 35% occupancy as a country. Some of the markets are a little bit higher than that. So we can argue that coming from sort of 7 or 8% occupancy at the 1st of Feb, you know, we can see that there has been some progress. We know China largely is a domestic market, but even though, you know, we might not necessarily have to take the occupancy and think of it that way, the fact that China is recovering, people are moving around, people are beginning to stay in hotels is a good thing, obviously. So that's where we sit really in China. And in terms of where China is in the whole sort of evolution of this problem, they are 2 or 3 weeks ahead of everywhere else. So you can just see 25th of April where China is. You would hope that Europe and, you know, to some extent the US will start to follow that trend line. So we're thinking and we are hoping there will be some sort of recovery, and we are currently at the bottom of the trend at the moment. There's some of the Chinese cities, you know, that is quite an encouraging trend. From the 1st of February, things have started to lift, particularly from early March through mid-March and into April. And we're continuing to see this trend. It's flattening a little bit. Some of the more leisure destinations are kind of hitting nearly 40%. Xi'an, Chengdu is a little bit stronger as well. So, you know, it's good to see that things are improving in some of the Chinese cities. And that is it. So I know that's very brief, but it gives you some idea of what's happening across the world and across Africa. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much, Philip. One important point on seeing how China is moving and having that as a follow-up indicator for all of us. Probably it took two months more or less to actually open up after the first closure. So we might see the same in Europe and other countries and start to see some positive movement around there, are encouraging signs. There was a question that came up to you on the data, I think, because there is a coverage of data in Northern Africa and some Southern Africa and not East-West, and I assume that's because of data coverage issues, but I'll leave you to clarify.
Well, yeah, I think with only a few minutes I probably should have done that. In fairness, we do have sample in East Africa, we do have sample in West Africa, albeit a little bit smaller. It is quite difficult at the moment, particularly in April, as more and more hotels are closing. I think I made a note, we've got around about 2,000 hotels that have closed across the region. That's 311,000 rooms. There may be a few more. So we're struggling a little bit in April in terms of keeping those markets alive. But if anyone wants to reach out to me later, I can certainly come back on that.
Thank you very much, Philip. I think that's one of the challenges we all face dealing with data, which is coverage, and particularly now with a shutdown in many places to really have that data available. So thank you so much. We'll now go into one of the key elements of the recovery, and which is confidence. Everyone's mentioned it. We can get borders to open, we can get the flights to start flying again, hotels open, but the big challenge we will have is obviously to motivate and ensure people that it is safe to travel. And to do that, it's very critical to actually have insights on consumer confidence and what are the conversations that are being highlighted, especially on online. And with that, I'll leave the floor to Olivier, who's going to talk about specifically destination sentiment. Olivier.
Yes, hi Sandra. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can hear me well. I'm just sharing the screen now. Is that okay for you?
All working.
All right, fine. So yeah, just like everybody, I was shaking, the crystal ball and $1 million question this morning again, and so trying to map when, where, who is going to travel again, and so on. And it's true to say that we have very, very few strict and firm answer to that question. So what we are trying to do at TCI is working along, the rebound for destinations, but focusing on the consumer sentiment, the destination reputation, and also the resident sentiment. The starting point is just to say that as soon as people will know where they are allowed to travel, and as soon as they can afford to travel, probably what they will choose as destination is the one that have been the least impacted by the crisis, and the one which, in terms of reputation, has gone through the crisis in a way that is not too dramatic. And so it's a question of trust, as you say. So what we look at there is understanding how the sentiment and reputation of the travel industry and the reputation of destinations in overall have been impacted. There is more chance people are going to choose destination with better reputation. Better reputation is actually fueling favorability to tomorrow. So the consumer, it's not only about consumer sentiment. What we do there is trying to understand everything which is said on social channels from consumers, of course, but also from companies, from officials, citizens, and the medias. And so the sentiment is really the sentiment at large. And why doing this in Africa overall, since the beginning of the crisis, so let's say beginning of January, there has been no less than 8.8 million of conversations across the world mentioning Africa in the context of travel and tourism associated with COVID-19. So it means that about 23% of total conversations about African destinations and travel overall is infused or impacted by the COVID-19, which obviously is usually bad stories. It may appear as quite high, but actually Africa has been relatively spared, if I can say that. It's obviously not the right word to say, but in terms of volume of conversations compared to Europe, which where there you have what destination Europe is kind of impacted 35%, or the US it's almost 40% of travel conversations mentioning COVID-19, and it's billions and billions of conversations. Africa so far has been relatively less exposed as a brand for travel and tourism. Then the film, there's been a couple of well, actually hundreds and thousands of stories, but some of them have been particularly fueling peaks, such as, of course, the first cases in South Africa, then travel restrictions. The idea generally that Africa, and there's a lot of conversations about that, might be less exposed right now in terms of reputation, but it's kind of a ticking time bomb, what's going to happen in the long term. And a couple of, kind of iconic stories like these lions napping on the road on the Kruger safari area. All these conversations actually are usually not good. It's a mix of many things around tourism bashing, travel bans, tourist traps in hotels, in cruise, destinations described as a kind of a huge epicenters of the outbreak. So the cause of everything, or being very inefficient in dealing with the crisis. And, the idea that sometimes a destination, which is usually highly popular, highly with high visitation or overcrowded, suddenly without any crowd of tourists, with no tourism, is beautiful, which is of course very bad for the reputation of travel overall and the destination in particular. And we are seeing a lot of disrespectful or disrespect between either visitors together or resident versus visitors. And Africa has also a share of that. But overall, so far, I would say compared to other regions, it's been relatively spared. And if we look at the overall reputation of Africa as a destination, compared with other big regions like the US or China or Europe, you see the green line is the score, the net sentiment score, which measures the polarity of conversations, positive versus negative, when talking about Africa overall as a destination in a travel and tourism context. And you see there that more or less, it's not that bad. It's actually obviously less bad than if you compare with China. You had your negative times, but overall there is, I mean, the rebound in terms of reputation is just starting up. However, having said that, to me, this curve is hiding another curve, which is the long-term curve. And what we see and feel from social conversations is a bit like, this ticking timing bomb. The reason being, if we look at what's going on there when the reputation is going down, it's really based on some of the aspects which are supposed to be DNA for attracting people in the destination, in Africa in particular. I'm just mentioning a few of them. There are growing concerns from not only consumers, but the whole travel industry about the ecosystem preservation. All the lockdown, all the economy impact may kind of put at risk the preservation of the wildlife, but also possible resurgence of poaching animals. So things which are really a DNA, because Africa is the worldwide, hub of the wildlife, and it's really known for that, and people go for that as well. So if that DNA is putting a bit at risk in the sentiment, it's not good. Then we have another set of negative sentiments around, cruise-related stories, a bit of civil riots, or fueling the idea that Africa may have some resurgence of insecurity overall. Not only sanitary insecurity, but also insecurity overall. A bit of a perception that there's a lack of testing at airports, or lack of screening at airports, and maybe some destinations, if I go there tomorrow, will they ensure that they have in place the kind of logistics? There are some doubts in some conversations about that. Plus a few other aspects, such as, for example, a French tourist, which have been charged for murder because he refused to do quarantine, which, by the way, is probably not the best thing to do, but it was kind of fueling also some sort of negative sentiment. Also, some secret trips from high officials. So they say you stay at home, but they travel on their own, and some questioning and stuff about, if I go tomorrow in Africa, how will they ensure social distancing, and how are they going to do that? So not all destinations, of course, have been impacted in the same way. Probably South Africa is one of it. There are also some other destinations which actually have not been so much touched in terms of reputation. Thinking about Tanzania, for example, or some of the ocean islands nearby. And having said that, one of the most important things to remember when we talk about reputation is that not all the sectors have been impacted that much. And that's very important from a destination management point of view, to consider reinsuring and communicating and engaging with stakeholders for those specific verticals which have been really badly impacted in reputation. And thinking about airports, airlines, the cruise industry, which are all being mentioned as really high zones of risk and possible epicenters of the disease. And from that, the way it's been managed is also from time to time not so positive. But on the other hand, if we look at the positive side, all the main cultural attractions and natural attractions, things around theme parks, festivals, safaris, and all these specific tourism experiences, they have been impacted, but somehow way less than destinations themselves. So what it means is, if you look at the sentiment for, on the one hand, so during the same period, we have an indicator showing then that the level of positiveness for conversations about travel in South Africa overall, You see that it's 43 points, which means it's still positive, but it's been impacted 34 points compared to last year. But if you, during the same period, so during the COVID-19 period, if you look at conversations about safari in South Africa, then you have 88 points, and it has not been impacted at all. So what it means is it's easier for consumer to envisage and to dream again about a safari in a destination than the destination overall itself. So from a DMO prospect, instead of just communicating, hey, come back again, we're safe at this destination, what you need to do is really promoting and co-marketing with your main iconic DNA attractions and experiences, because the more you focus on experiences, tourism experiences, instead of just the country, the more you prevent from people thinking about all the non-tourism factors that can influence the attractiveness of the destination as a country. So I leave you with just a few bullet points. Actually, three of them from everything that the kind of trends we can learn from social conversations as a whole, and those which are particularly important, I think, for Africa. The first is about sustainability and responsible tourism, which definitely is now the new normal. It used to be a trend before COVID-19, is now becoming a new normal, and how far you as a destination are going to be to take a leadership on that, particularly when it comes to protect the environment, which is a clue and a key DNA of your destination tractor. Then really looking at the most at-risk verticals, airports, cruise, airlines, public transports. There's a growing concern on the long term that in Africa, everything is done from a logistic point of view to ensure that particular safety feeling. All that should be not only an advertising and a communication, but it should be concrete. So there's a growing conversations and growing expectations about destinations sanitary certification for really generating visitor confidence. That's a global trend, but it's particularly sensitive in African destinations. And last but not least, the role of a central, let's say, frontline kind of level. So the one who are going to host and welcome your next post-COVID-19 visitors in, at the airport, receptionists, transport staff, the shops staffs, info centers, all the tourist guides. They really need to be in the front priority for you in terms of training and communicating, because these are the ones who are going to fuel your destination for tomorrow. People have always chosen destination for the first reason that they have heard good experiences from friends and relatives about that. That will continue, and probably even more in the future. So those are
Olivier,
the ones.
I'm really sorry to interrupt you, but we really need to wrap up, and we still have Carmen to give her her presentation to us, and we're 15 minutes away from having to disconnect. Thank you so much. I'm really sorry. I will repeat what Elsie mentioned in the beginning. All presentations and materials, and especially the link to the webinar live in YouTube will be available online, so you can have access to all that information. We are very tight in time, and I think just stressing on that point that Oliver mentioned, choose your highlights in the destination, and I think that's a very important point to keep. But before and to speed up our ending, we have with us Carmen Nigivida. She's a policy analyst, and we've been talking about data, and data doesn't make any sense if we can't use it for policy decision making. So we'd like to wrap up with Carmen, and especially because Carmen's on the ground, she knows the challenges that African destinations face. So Carmen, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for being with us.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. First of all, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me to this conversation. But first of all, I would like to say that I am quite surprised to see that all the presentations done are more or less centered around the same source market. and then a story around hotel occupancy and the sentiment of the tourists from an outsider perspective. But from what I also believe is that if you don't make a difference between the variables and indicators you want to measure, sometimes you only capture one part of the story. So for instance, I've noticed that we are not talking about cross-border movement of people who are not even flying, but are using the roads, which is a huge part of our tourism segment in Africa. We are not looking at Africa at a granular level where we need to move beyond RevPAR, occupancy, number of seats, and then airlines coming to Africa, because I feel like now I'm actually addressing this to my my counterparts, my friends. I have seen ministers on this platform. I have seen tourism board on this platform presented. I think for you who are watching from the African continent, this is a huge gap. The data and the intelligence is in the hands of those who are defining, I think, how our industry can be informed to take the right decisions. So maybe tourism board listening, ministers are listening to this platform, any player, I would like to say it's appalling and actually very challenging to see that the data available is not there, not because it's not there, maybe just because we are not really collaborating and then bringing the data together. So this is, first of all, the number one call to action. We have been poorly doing the job of collecting data, having a purpose why we collect the data, and then take action for data. So if I take the example of a region I'm very familiar with is the East African community. You know, even if I look at the 5 or 6 countries of the East African community, it's still a challenge for ministers of tourism or tourism board to come up with data which inform a business operator where he needs to invest his money, where he needs to put his action, and then make it in a very simple way that someone can understand what is at stake. So the argument here is we definitely know that COVID-19 is going to change drastically the landscape. Our source markets are not going to come back in the next maybe 18 months or up to 2 years. And then the conversation I keep hearing every single day since maybe end of February or March is that inter and intra tourism for Africa is going to drive the recovery phase. But we need to also to frame what is at stake and the issue. We are lacking data. We are not measuring what we need to inform our decision. And we know that the tourism in Africa is so integrated industry, which benefits several actors: aviation, agriculture, food transformation, name it. It's all those connected parts, which often make the big picture and then can give a story. Let's say for the sake of the conversation, we say domestic tourism is going to drive our new next phases for recovery, or we even go for inter or intra tourism in Africa. I would like maybe to challenge my counterpart and my friends on this platform and beyond, whoever is going to listen to this. What would be the basis of that decision? Because if you cannot drive that discussion, then it will be very, very hard. And we have noticed that with COVID-19, the people who are suffering because of the situation we are in are usually the people who are at the peripheral, you know, the small SMEs, often undocumented, working in the informal sector, often hardly making it happen. And those are the actors usually the data doesn't capture. And then if we talk about the future of tourism for the East African community or the continent at the global level, and then data is going to inform us on our decision. We needed to invest in IT. That's not enough. I think for me, we need to invest in intelligence in order to objectively know what kind of data we need, how do we collect it, and then what measures we put in place for that, and then look at the development goals. Why do we collect the data? Is it to inform on job creation? Do we want to improve our livelihood of our communities around our national parks? I think what I would like to say is that data is more than any other time important, but we need to make sound argument and robust policies to drive that agenda why data is more than ever important. So if that helps us to navigate through this with clear information, more beyond telling the story, then we can have a new way of measuring and also communicate. It's a shame. I feel like I'm compelled to feel to do more, because I don't think we have information or data to really portray the real picture of what is happening on the continent. Maybe it's a call to action to everyone out there who's representing our tourism board and then our intelligence services, anyone who's in that space. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carmen, for making that point. I think the biggest challenge is really threefold. Is first to identify your KPIs, as you mentioned, making sure that they're connected with the SDGs, which at the end are a framework for action of all of us. The second one is data availability, and we saw with STR data, and we see it ourselves with the UNWTO data. We're now collecting the first 3 months, and unfortunately, Africa is still our most challenging area. And but I have faith, because we've seen this some 5-7 years ago with Central and Latin America, and we've seen that that has improved very much. And I do believe that if we all work together, the same will be seen in Africa. And it's very interesting to your point on data priority, because if you see the voting and the main reason why we don't have data, and the biggest challenge was identified by everyone as the lack of coordination with data partners in my country. So I think there's our participants agree with you. There is a need to start working locally. And I think, well, I'll leave Elsia to close this debate, but I think UNWTO and international organizations such as the World Bank have a role to play there. And I'm sure that together we can improve the situation, because without data, you can't really make the right decisions. From my side, as I said, we're tight on time. I want to thank all the panelists that joined us. I want to say also that this is just the first of many. We're probably, unfortunately, going to see the crisis extending, as Carmen said, for some time. I'm sure we'll be back to discuss this issue and maybe go into the methodology and what data we have, what we don't have. And I want to thank everyone for their contributions. And without other comments from my side, I'll invite Elsia to just close the webinar and refer again that all presentations will be online and available and sent to all the participants. Thank you for much everyone that joined, and I hope to see you soon from my side.
Thank you, Sandra. I think you want to close the poll as well. But on my side, what I can say is thank you very much to all that has participated in this panel. And Carmen, I think you rounded off very well at the end. I've seen also several of our partners on this platform, ministers as well. We've heard you. All the points that was raised is very pertinent, and everybody agrees. There's still a lot of work to be done, especially in our region where data collection is concerned. But as Sandra said, it's a work that we have to do together in continuous effort. And my point is to say that we at UNWTO, through the agenda that we have for Africa, this is where we are trying also to bring all partners together to work closer more than ever. And I think with this crisis, a lot of rethinking is being done, especially by our different member states that we work with. And the shift, I think we will see in where the priority also is lying in terms of the areas that we want to focus on. And data collection statistics is very critical for the region. That we all agree. And you can rest assured that UNWTO is committed to work with our member states towards that, and our partners as well. And because of time, as Sandra said, we will be closing here. There were a few questions as well about whether we will have other webinars, but conducted in French for the other members, the French-speaking member states. We are working on that, so to try at least to get everybody to have a sense of what is going on as well. So we will keep you posted, and thank you again to all the presenters. Once again, we will share the outcome of this webinar, as well as, I think now you've closed the poll, right, Sandra?
Yes, I have, and I'll share the results. I think you can see them on the screen very clearly.
Elsia, can I just maybe have 1 minute? I think I was the least given more time. Maybe I just want to drive a key message, and I'm glad that I can see that the decision makers are on this platform. Yes, we have a long way to go, but this is a beginning. I think COVID-19 has given us an opportunity to review where our priorities are, and then for when it comes to data, I would like maybe to make to just ask all the policymakers on this platform, make it your priority that you will not decide on any source market where you're going to go or where you're going to make your priorities unless it's driven by data. More and more, we know that we will need to communicate to our partners, our stakeholders, and then make it collectively an African agenda. I think this is going to be the way forward. Thank you, Elsia.
Thank you, Carmen. Sandra?
Yes, thank you. I think you've seen the result of the polls. So clearly, I think we have an agenda, invest in data. It's, as Carmen said, an opportunity here. Let's transform COVID-19 into an opportunity for data in Africa. And let's start with a coordination with data partners locally, identifying the relevant information, building our budget, which is always a challenge as well, and building skills. With that, I think I will close again. Thank everyone. Thank Philip. Thank you, Sarah, Olivier, and Olivier. And thank you, Carmen, for that African insight, bringing us to the ground. And as Elsie said, we hope to be here en français la prochaine fois. I hope to see you all soon.
And thank you to all our technicians at the back for making this happen. Thank you all. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you to the UNWTO Academy, which is making sure we're all here together on time. And we hope to see you all soon.
Sure. Thank you.
Keep safe.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.